good morning, good evening, or what have you. It's time for another session with me, Mr. Fowler, your inimitable host, as we once again delve into our discussions about The Princess Bride. I hope that you had a good day off this past Tuesday. That was a sanctioned state day off so that students could go out and vote in the election. And as you probably are well aware at this point, as of this recording, we have not yet discovered who will be the next president of the United States. Whether it will remain with our incumbent or whether or not Joe Biden will be the new president. As of this recording, it's still unknown. But I hope that you were able to utilize some of your time on this past Tuesday to exercise your given right to vote as an American citizen. Any part of the process in which you play a role is one step forward to having everybody say their piece. And I think that's important. And I hope you feel the same way too. But the world doesn't stop just for elections. It doesn't stop for the coronavirus. Can't stop going. We have to always move forward. So in that event, let's get back to The Princess Bride. I'm going to share a screen with you for a few moments. And we'll talk about our agenda for today. I always love how the end of these are previewed. Oh well. Okay. So today, session 23 will involve a little preview and review. I want to first address your persuasive essays. Then we'll move into a lecture. That's going to be a fairly lengthy lecture for this week. Luckily, only one though, because of our strange schedule. The Princess Bride will be covered, and I'm going to recap Chapter 5. And then we'll talk about the new content from Chapter 6, Part 1, which is, again, roughly pages 203 to 233. Then I will briefly discuss this week's discussion question and give you some work time built into that before we move on to some reminders. Obviously, if you haven't done so already, I would encourage you to continue reading in The Princess Bride, finishing Chapter 6 for next Monday, which would be covered from between pages 233 and 264. I think a number of you have already finished the book based on some of the material that you covered in your persuasive essays. Nevertheless, I think it's worthwhile mentioning that part of the process. Okay. So I'm going to just say a few words about your persuasive essays. As of the uploading of this video, they should all be graded and corrected. I think I might have had one or two outstanding papers that were missing. If that pertains to you, try to do your best to get it in this week. Today, Thursday, for you all, will be the first day that it takes a hit because we didn't meet on Monday and we didn't meet on Tuesday. So really you've had, incremental gaps there that are saving your grade. So at the end of the day today, the end of the day Thursday, it will only just now be getting knocked down to a B level if it wasn't turned in. By Friday afternoon, you still have that much time and you can get it in and you can still receive a C. But heading into the next weekend, basically a week after it was due, I'm really going to have to start hammering down on the grade. So if you didn't get that essay in, get it in as soon as you can. But for those of you who did get it in on time, I have to say I was more than pleased with the results that I got from your papers. You all did an excellent job using creative sources to express really logical arguments and to make claims and assert those claims in ways that shored up your philosophies and opinions. And I think that's the key. If you've managed to do that, you've been successful. So you should feel good about that. You can check for those results and desire to learn, as well as feedback that you can click on and download. If you have any trouble finding that, or you can't access that content and material, as always, email me so I can send it to you directly. Okay, back to our share screen. You're going to lose my video, but you should still be able to hear my voice as I walk you through the next couple of moments. Okay, here we go. The Princess Bride, Chapter 6, Part 1. Our story so far. Eager for war with neighboring Gilder, Prince Humperdinck of Florin arranges for the assassination of his bride-to-be, Buttercup. But the man in black, aka Wesley, follows Buttercup. Initially, he's intending to kidnap her during her evening horse ride, but Humperdinck's hired assassins to get there first. So he is forced into following them. The idea is to kidnap her away from Humperdinck so that they can be together and get married themselves. But like I said, Vizzini, along with his two henchmen, Inigo and Fezzik, are prepared to carry out Humperdinck's orders. So we meet in Chapter 5 the three greatest assassins in the world, according to the leader, Vizzini. We have Vizzini, the planner or thinker, and we have the swordsman, Inigo Montoya, whose tragic history has led him away from his true path of revenge and into the employ of Vizzini. And Fezzik, the eighth wonder of the world, the muscle man, the literal giant who can do anything with his immense strength. But Wesley is a man fighting for honor, and he has the true love connection with Buttercup, and that seems to invest him with almost preternatural powers. So despite Inigo's years of training, Wesley beats him in a duel. He defeats, maybe tricks Fezzik by using his stealth and speed. And then when he's finally confronts Vizzini, he uses his great stamina and ability to test himself or grow accustomed to poison and outlives him after poisoning 2 cups of wine. Now, once reunited with his great love, Buttercup, Wesley reveals his identity. As the two escape into the fire swamp, Prince Humperdinck and his right-hand man, Count Rugen, are following them, and they surround them at the other side of the fire swamp, along with 3 soldiers who I'll be referring to in a few minutes in their unfortunate fate. But as they emerge from the fire swamp, they're confronted by that cadre of soldiers along with Humperdinck and Rugen. Buttercup says, okay, I haven't met Wesley again after all this time just to go through the pain of losing him once again. So I will not allow this. She says, I'm going to agree to go back with you, Humperdinck, and if you just let Wesley live, that'll be good enough. Wesley doesn't agree to these terms, but is still happy to not have to die and have another chance to reunite with Buttercup. However, he's taken prisoner, though, as he knows he would be. Just before he's thumped on the head, though, he does recognize that from his battle with Inigo Montoya, the description of Count Rugen's 6 fingers that he rocks on his right hand. So we have a connection building in the wings as it is lights out for Wesley. That brings us up to date for this portion of the class, Chapter 6, Part 1. And strangely, even though it's, hard for me to swallow, the chapter begins with Goldman mocking literature professors. How dare he? Now you know why this book isn't studied very often. And of course, I'm just kidding. But Goldman has another one of his asides, and he has several in chapter 6. He begins by using this first aside to explain that professors and elitists will often separate themselves from the more casual reader. He mocks the way in which his fictional professor speaks or writes. And I just want to turn to this page for a moment. So bear with me as I turn to the page. I just thought it was so funny. That's how he talks, he says. You'd think I'd have this primed and ready, wouldn't you? Okay, yeah. He says, Professor Bongiorno of Columbia, the Florinese guru, claims that Morgenstern's satiric genius is its fullest flower. That's the way this guy talks. Fullest flower. Delicious drolleries. On and on. So I think that's a very apropos moment where a writer talks about the idea or confronts the notion that when constructing a story, it's constructed for a specific readership. And in this case, probably a younger readership, his daughters. But also, as the novel grew into something that Goldman thought might stand a chance at the legitimate market, he expands it for readers. And I think he has something to say to his reader, even if it's not necessarily a detailed satire of the kind that Swift wrote with Gulliver's Travels, or that the great tradition of something like Candide might include as part of that more elitist or more elite group of literary satires. So I just found that to be interesting. Whoops, I'm going to advance a little bit too quickly there. Humperdinck, of course, we are told, has to cut back on his hunting and focus more on the matters of the estate, of how to govern Florin, because his father, King Lotharin, has taken a step backward in his overall health. But we do learn 3 essential details. The first is that the people have bought into the plot of Gilder to kidnap Buttercup. And so tensions are rising between the people of Gilder and the people of Florin. Buttercup is admired even more by the average citizen, by the people of Florin, because she acted particularly bravely, we're told. And Humperdinck, of course, for his part in the process, is heralded as a hero. Then we spend some time catching up with our erstwhile heroes. Inigo, having woken up with his battle, after his battle with Wesley, heads back to the beginning, as Vizzini instructed. We learn that years ago, when they first met in the Thieves' Quarter in Florin, specifically at Falkbridge's alehouse, Vizzini said, if anything ever goes wrong or a plan is spoiled, come back here where we first met and wait for me, and then we will reorganize and begin again. But there's another aside quickly after this from Goldman, the second of, I believe, 5 such asides, where he discusses the fleeting glory of the poet Robert Browning. So why bring up Robert Browning? Well, this is kind of interesting. You can see a photo of the gentleman here on the right-hand side of your screen. But one of Browning's most famous poems was the piece My Last Duchess. And I think this is very interesting because it tells the story of a new bride marrying a wealthy husband, the Duke of Ferrara, who most likely, it's heavily suggested in the poem, had killed his former lover. Now, this has two various interesting permutations for us. Number one, this describes exactly the sort of predicament that Buttercup finds herself in. Marriage to a wealthy man who is planning to strangle her in her sleep. But also, it raises a question about a character that we have not heard from in a while. Remember the Countess Rugen? Count Rugen's wife? She kind of shows up and flirts with Wesley, sort of stoking the fire of Buttercup's desire for him. What happened to her? Now, it's true she might not be particularly important to this story as it's being told, but I think there's something menacing lurking in the background in this reference to Robert Browning. Maybe I'm reading too far into this sort of thing, but a little food for thought. We next cut back to Fezzik. Now, Fezzik wakes up and goes to search for Vizzini, whom he finds dead. After trying to get some information from his corpse, which of course proves completely unsuccessful, he actually returns to the Cliffs of Insanity, which I think is a pretty smart move. And he's looking for Inigo, but Inigo has unfortunately already fled back, and Fezzik cannot remember the rhyme he created to find his way back to connect with Vizzini and Inigo in the way that Inigo had remembered. So he finds himself alone, which is one of the most miserable experiences that Fezzik ever had to deal with. He was first abandoned by the circus in Greenland, where he was found by Vizzini, and now, alone again, he recalls some of those same negative feelings or emotions. He actually begins to head off toward Gilder, calling after Inigo, assuming that he might just be able to catch up to him, and maybe he could hear him, hear his massive voice. But that doesn't come to pass. So as night falls and he still finds himself alone, he eventually takes shelter in a cave. Now, this isn't so bad until the next morning, because children discover him. And after they conquer their initial fear due to his size, they begin to kind of tease him. And he's put into a notion to remember his childhood, which also brings him to a low ebb. Lastly, we do some catching up with Wesley, the man in black himself. He awakes to find himself in the fifth and deepest level of the pit of despair, or the zoo of death, as it's referred to in the book. Now, remember from chapter 2 that the zoo of death is a multi-layered zoo or stable where Humperdinck houses his most deadly hunting catches, the animals that he admires and uses to keep himself on edge, to challenge himself, if you will, to consistently avoid their cruelty and reflexes. So Wesley gathers that he is to be tortured, and he has a rather comical exchange with this gentleman over here on the right-hand side, the albino, and he begins to prepare his mind for the experience of being tortured. Now, given the book's context in its publication in 1973, I think it's fair to suggest that William Goldman probably had in mind some of the stories that were coming out of the resolution of the Vietnam conflict, and how some of the American prisoners of war had to deal with not only the physical strife that they were put through, but with a mental burden that they carried home with them after the war. If you've never heard about any of these kinds of things, former Senator, I think now, John McCain, McCain, I just call him John McCain. Let's try that again. John McCain talked about his experiences, and they were quite horrendous. So if you're interested in researching this topic as a possible research topic for our next assignment, just be prepared for the fact that this is pretty, rough material. So there's a bit of a warning, so to speak, for those of you who may want to pursue this notion or this concept as a potential paper topic for your final essay. Does Goldman create some sort of allusion to the experiences of soldiers in the post-Vietnam era when he talks about torture? When he talks about how the victims of torture mentally prepare themselves for the rigors of what they know they're going to go through. Then back in Florin, of course, we catch up with Buttercup. And we're given a series of dreams. She is growing tired of the festivities. And as Prince Humperdinck prepares to take over the matters of the state due to his father's ill health, she asks once more to walk among the people, the commoners of Florin. And in her first dream, we find that she is booed this time. And specifically that she's castigated by a gnarled old woman who charges her with trading true love, which she had with Wesley, which saved her in the fire swamp, with abandoning that sort of thing for the comforts of wealth and luxury. Of course, it's just a dream, though. But that's a big deal for Goldman, because we get another aside, and he explains the dream tricked him and kind of set him up into a sense of argument with his father. And that creates another memory where he is visiting a neighbor, and his neighbor's his neighbor's parent was a writer, and she explains to him one of the themes that he believes is key. And it's a big key to understanding the satire behind this novel, which is that life is not fair. Kind of an uncharacteristic idea for an adventure story or fairy tale, even one that's being told in a satirical vein. But as he writes in the book, this woman, his neighbor's parent, explains that life isn't fair, Bill. We tell our children that it is, but it's a terrible thing to do. It's not only a lie, you see, it's a cruel lie. Life is not fair, and it never has been, and it's never going to be. So maybe that's part of the entire satire here, that there's a longing in our society, an expectation almost, for things to be better than they were. Now you could say, well, Mr. Fowler, that's kind of a played out notion. I've seen Shrek. I've seen other films and stories that explain that this is not the case. I saw Frozen. I know Elsa doesn't need a guy to make her happy. All that's true, but I think The Princess Bride may be one of the first sort of riffs or satires of the standard fairy tale tropes. And in that case, I think that would mark the text as particularly noteworthy. Now, from this first dream, we move on to the second and third dreams. So in the second and third dream, Buttercup imagines herself having children. And the first dream depicts her having a daughter. But this magical child, this young girl, seems to only be interested in telling her mother that she does not love her father and that she's going to be a miserable child because she knows her mother loves Wesley. And that's how she really feels about things. Now, in the next dream, she has a son, very similar structure. But this one features a version of the son who refuses to meet with her and wants to be taken away. Again, magical child. He asks to be taken away by his nurse and then refuses to meet with his mother. And she says, well, he can't refuse to meet with me. I'm the queen. And he does refuse again, and this time sends a note. And he says, I'm afraid to meet with you because you are a killer of men. And just as you watched your beloved Wesley die or be sent away, I'm afraid that since I am a male, you have some desire to destroy me. In the last dream, Buttercup is sort of a incorporeal or uncorporeal viewer who gets to sit in on her own birth. Now, things really go well, except when she's delivered, the midwife explains that there's no heartbeat. Her parents think that this is a big tragedy. And they say, no. The maid explains, the midwife explains, no, she's not dead. She's alive, but she has no heart. And I've seen creatures like this before. They leave cruelty and bodies of the beloved and of the caring in their wake. And the parents, of course, are panicked. They say, all right, well, what do we do? The midwife consoles them and says, you're both young. You'll have time to have another child. But this child, since she is destined to become extremely beautiful and be very cruel to people, you should just strangle her right now so that you can save yourselves and the world quite a bit of trouble. Now, this is interesting because we know that Prince Humperdinck has been practicing his strangling technique using really oddly, this is and a student mentioned this in the last paper, and I have to agree, it's one of the more disturbing images in the book, where Prince Humperdinck is practicing his strangulation technique by using sausages, which I think is just kind of odd, but like also strangely possible in some way. There's like a hint of truth to that, if that makes any sense. So this is a bit of a little bit of foreshadowing and sort of a thematic trend that William Goldman sort of sows through the narrative, which I thought was so interesting. At some point after that, Buttercup says, I can't, she goes to the prince and says, I can't sleep. And he says, what's wrong? He says, I am afraid that I'm not in love with you. And Prince Humperdinck, for his, for what it's worth, he takes this fairly openly, and he says, well, here's the deal. I wouldn't want to force you to marry me, which is a total lie. But he says, Wesley has not come back. I put him on his ship, the Revenge, and he has yet to return. So perhaps, once he saw your willingness to marry me, he maybe decided that he's not so in love with you after all. Buttercup says, this isn't possible. And Humperdinck is sort of impressed with the stories that she tells him about Wesley. And he says, okay, if that's true, I'll make you a deal. You write a letter, and I will have that letter copied in triplicate. And once the letter has been copied, I will give a copy of each of the letters to the captains of my 4 fastest ships. And I will send them in the 4 cardinal directions, north, east, south, west. And eventually they'll come across the Revenge, and they'll be able to give the letter directly to Wesley. But, he says, I will challenge you with this. If Wesley, for some reason, still decides not to return, Perhaps you will then, rather than kill yourself or risk a life of perpetual dis-ease, maybe consider going through with the marriage. And Buttercup actually agrees to this. So this is about the point where I lose it with her as a character, because I don't understand how she can be so readily tricked at this point. And it's to her credit that later in this chapter she catches Humperdinck in a lie, but we'll talk about that next time. But still, here in this moment, I'm like, why would you trust him at this point? Don't you have some sense of, I don't know, don't you have a sense that this guy may be lying to you? Wesley would just give up after all these years and then attempting to kidnap you and going to all the extremes to save you. And then he's just going to abandon you and Gilder? That's such bunk. I can't believe she would even consider that. So yeah, that's a big WTH moment for me as a reader. I don't know about you, but it sort of set me off a little bit. And then the chapter concludes with the construction of the machine. And Wesley describes watching Count Rugen and the albino cart all of the various constituent pieces of the machine down into the fifth and final level of the Zoo of Death, where straps and suction cups are attached to this machine, and Wesley has to endure the horror of waiting and pondering to see exactly what this torture device is going to do. Here, the prince and Humperdinck showcase their truly sadistic nature as they debate which they believe to be the worse, the torture of the mind or the torture of the body. The other odd thing that they commit to here is to ask Wesley if he is a soldier of Gilder who had ill intent for the princess. Now, they both know who Wesley really is, and they both know what his true intentions were. So why do they bother to even go through this premise? Well, theoretically, they may be engaging in a time-honored tactic of torturers, which is to suggest that there may be some cause and an off chance that what they're doing is right. They're trying to create the conditions for themselves to justify torture. Because after all, they're torturing Wesley in the hopes to elicit information that he cannot possibly give them. And we know that their conniving knows no bounds, because when Wesley consults with the albino says, no one else knows you're here except the prince and the count and myself. And he says, well, what about the 3 guards that brought me here? And the albino alludes to the fact that they were killed for their trouble, so that no one knows he's there, so that their torture can go on day and night unabated. Essentially, they really don't want him to confess to anything. They're just sadists who now have the perfect, what would you say, specimen with which to test out their evil machines. And that draws us to a conclusion for this week's discussion. If you have not yet finished Chapter 6 of The Princess Bride, please go ahead and do that for next Monday. And in the meantime, in between time, you can occupy yourself by completing this week's discussion question. So let's take a look at that real quickly. I'm going to sign in to my Kish webpage, and then I'll share that with you. And once we read through the question, I'll close out today's session and you may go ahead and work on this question. I know we have a shorter time to respond to this discussion forum, but it's still, I think, important to have the chance to do that. Okay, so here we go. Let's see. I've got it up here. I'm going to go ahead and share the screen with you all. And let's see. Discussion questions. So for week 8, chapter 6 contains another 3 parenthetical asides from Goldman. During the third such aside, he quotes the mother of one of his childhood friends, Edith Neisser. And Goldman explains that she is the author of, quote, terrific books on how we screw up our children, unquote. And she tells him, as I stated before, life isn't fair, Bill. We tell our children it is, but it's a terrible thing to do. It's not only a lie, it's a cruel lie. Life is not fair, and it never has been, and it's never going to be. So the question for you to consider is, do you think these words sum up the novel of The Princess Bride? Why or why not? So that's something for you to ponder as we get ready to wrap this week up and move ahead into new content for the next weeks. Now on Monday, we're going to go through chapter 6 and finish that. Then if you want to continue to do some reading, we're going to, on Wednesday, cover chapter 7 in the text of The Princess Bride. So you can read as much of that as you wish to do. And then I'm also going to introduce our final writing project for this semester. Then we'll only have one other weekend between that and the start of the writing process for the final paper, in which we'll read chapter 8. Now, like I said, I know a few of you have already finished the book, and that's wonderful. So you'll be in a perfectly primed position to start the paper assignment. But for those of you who want to go ahead and watch the videos and go through the content with me, I'm happy to do that with you as well. So until next Monday, this is Mr. Fowler signing off. I bid you the best weekend you can possibly have, and I'll talk to you some more on Monday. Take care.